Today I wanted to go through an article that was in the Huffington Post called "What an LGBTQ-Inclusive Sex Education Would Have Taught You." This article claims that we're doing a disservice to all children when we leave LGBTQ kids out of sex education at school. And one of the things that I see happening, which is concerning to me, is that we are sexualizing children at a younger and younger age. And one of the reasons that we're doing this is to try to be inclusive. But what this does is it actually gives children an unrealistic and potentially dangerous impression of what sexuality is and what sexual identity is. And on a fundamental level, children really shouldn't be concerned with these things because most children do not become sexual until they're adolescents. Most children shouldn't become sexual until they're adolescents unless they've already been sexualized. And perhaps the reason that I'm so concerned about this is because I was sexualized, and I know that it's taken me a lifetime to undo the damage of being sexualized at a young age. If we start introducing these ideas at a younger and younger age, then we're already telling children that they are sexual objects, that they are sexual beings, and that this is something that they need to concern themselves with at, as young as kindergarten, when kindergartners shouldn't even be thinking about sexuality. They should just be being kids. The other thing is that inclusivity now tends to include the idea of sex positivity. Again, the sexualization of our children. So this article starts out with, when parents and sex educators talk about the need for more inclusive, sex-positive sex education in America, we're not talking about much, they say. They say they don't want much, but let me show you what they do want, what they're talking about when they talk about inclusivity and sex positivity. Number one, kids' gender identity development starts early in life, so we should talk about transgender and identity issues early in life too. So they want to start talking about gender identity and the concept that children can be transgender earlier and earlier in school. What I want to point out is there are no transgender children. There are children with gender dysphoria. If a child has gender dysphoria and is told that the only treatment for them is to transition, we're actually converting children who have gender dysphoria into transgender individuals, when they could actually benefit from having time to work through gender identity issues, rather than being told that they're born in the wrong body. So the idea that that they want to talk about gender identity at younger and younger ages in our school could be really damaging, because really children don't typically think about their gender identity unless they're being taught very rigid stereotypes of what gender identity means, and unless they have to adhere to really strict sex roles. So introducing gender identity issues as part of sex education is actually a very regressive approach to sex education, because it suggests that children who do not conform to traditional stereotypes and sex roles are potentially transgender. And this is just not the case. This is not a way to promote inclusivity. This is a way to promote gender dysphoria, and ultimately a way to promote the transitioning of healthy kids, which would in some ways not be the end of the world if it wasn't that transitioning often pushes kids on a path towards using harmful hormones to stunt their growth and to cause their functional body to be dysfunctional. So this is a big deal. It's not just, oh, we're simply going to talk about transgender kids and inclusivity. We're actually going to try to convince kids that if they don't follow strict, rigid stereotypes and gender roles, that perhaps they're born in the wrong body. And of course, they do this. Given the higher rate of suicide for teens who are transgender, especially those who are bullied, this kind of information could really bolster proven suicide prevention strategies. Of course, they're going to pull out the good old suicide, because that's the go-to for the transgender movement, to talk about how these children are going to kill themselves if we do not affirm their gender identity. And I'm so sick of this. I did some research on suicide last night, and it turns out that white middle-aged men have the highest rate of suicide, and I don't see anybody trying to suggest that we develop suicide prevention programs for the highest risk group that we have. Instead, we're going to tell children that it's possible to be born in the wrong body, and that they're likely to become suicide if they're not allowed to physically change their body so that it matches the gender that they think they are based on the rigid stereotypes and sex roles that have been presented to them by these sex educators in school. The second thing is that periods are natural and affect our lives, not just those who identify with girls. And so what they want to do is stop having sex-separated menstrual cycle education for girls. And for most of us who are older, when we had the talk at school, they separated us into boys and girls. And these people are suggesting that we don't separate kids because we want to be inclusive. And what I want to point out is that it was very good to be separated, because girls are going to ask questions when they're in a girls-only space that they would never ask if there are boys around. This is protective. And the idea that boys can have periods too is a lie. Boys do not have periods. Men do not have periods. And so they're suggesting that we not only allow boys and girls to have this sex education at the same time, something that's very uncomfortable for girls and will really stymie their ability to ask questions and get the information that they need, but we're also going to give them misinformation that boys can have periods too, which as a child I can't imagine how confusing that would be. And this is not to benefit the girls. This is about inclusivity. They don't want trans and non-binary kids to have to choose which lesson they go to. So instead, they'll combine all the kids into one lesson, making it less comfortable for biological girls and less comfortable for biological boys, all in an effort to make sure that trans and non-binary kids don't feel uncomfortable. The third part of this new curriculum is that LGBTQ teens might be at more risk for STDs and pregnancy than their straight peers. All right, why is that? Well, it's because they're more sexually promiscuous. They want to promote sexual positivity, which we know results in a higher rate of sexually transmitted infections and pregnancy. So why is it that we want to promote sexual positivity for children so that they can experience unwanted pregnancies and sexually transmitted infections? And I know they're going to say that we'll talk about protection, but the fact is that it's hard enough for grown-ups to be assertive enough to insist that their partner use a condom or engage in safe sex techniques. And now we're going to be suggesting that children set these boundaries when we've already taught them that they can't really set their boundaries because we want to be sex positive. And especially girls can't set their boundaries because if they want to be in sex segregated spaces, they're transphobic. So this whole message really promotes promotes sexuality and all the things that come along with sexuality when somebody isn't really ready to be sexual, when someone really isn't able to provide meaningful consent, when somebody doesn't know how to set their boundaries. They say that truly inclusive sex ed should be centered on discussions about STIs as absolutely normal and commonplace. I'm not entirely sure why it is that we want to promote this, because it seems to me like promoting infection and pregnancy isn't necessarily something good. It's not something I would like to promote. I would like to promote responsible sexuality. Number four, there's so much more to sex than basic penis-in-vagina heterosexual sex. I'm really not comfortable with teachers talking to my children about this. They would like to talk about oral sex, anal sex, digital stimulation. All these are valid ways to feel pleasure. All right, again, why are we sexualizing our children? Why do we want to teach them at an earlier and earlier age the different ways in which they can have sexual interactions? Oral sex, anal sex, digital stimulation, otherwise known as fingering or hand jobs. This is information that's all part of the sexual positivity message that this inclusive sex education promotes. The idea is, let me read this quote. When we teach the diverse ways bodies can interact pleasurably, it allows each person to decide what they feel comfortable with instead of feeling limited or obligated to have intercourse. Well, maybe. The whole idea, I think, is that if something feels good, we should do it, even if we're children. Okay, the next one. Your sexuality is fluid throughout your lifetime. Don't get too hung up on labels. Oh, look who's talking. These are the people who seem to foster labeling of everything, so that we have how many different gender identities now and how many different inclusive flags. So it's very interesting to me now that the LGBTQ community for a long time said that our sexuality was innate and biological, and there was nothing we could do to change it. So if you were homosexual, you're homosexual. If you were heterosexual, you were heterosexual. There's nothing you can do to change that. Now they're coming along and saying, well, actually, our sexuality is fluid. So don't worry about labeling yourself. Just do whatever feels good. And it doesn't matter if you do that with a male or female, because there isn't really such a thing as a male or female, because gender itself is fluid and flexible and non-binary, and you can be creative with it. So even if you think you're having sex with a male, you may not be, because penises don't define gender. And so it's possible that you're actually in a homosexual relationship with someone who looks like they're heterosexual, and this gets so confusing, which is why I am extremely uncomfortable with it being taught to our children, because it is so nuanced, and it is promoting the idea that our sexuality is fluid, that our gender is fluid, and that we should just do what feels good. And what feels good results in a higher rate of STDs, a higher rate of pregnancy, and the inability to consent, to provide meaningful consent and to set boundaries. All of this undermines children's ability to provide safety for themselves. All of this undermines children's ability to set boundaries and to understand the ramifications of having a sexual relationship. By teaching children the sex-positive approach to sexuality, what we're doing is we're introducing information to them that they're not ready to have, that they're emotionally and developmentally not able to process. And what happens when you do that is that they end up with very confused messages, and they end up engaging in behavior that's dangerous, which is why LGBTQ youth have the highest rates of sexually transmitted infections and unwanted pregnancies. All right, the next one is open and honest discussions about body parts and what is considered normal and valid. And this one, I believe that we are going to talk about the fact that a penis does not indicate that someone's a boy, and a vagina does not indicate that someone's a girl. That we have these body parts, but they don't indicate our gender or even our sex. They are suggesting that children should learn about anatomy and a complete picture of the body's erogenous capacities, which include nipples and anus. The way anatomy is taught currently tends to focus on the reproduction and sometimes on health. So they want to teach children about erogenous zones. They're trying to teach children that sexuality is just like any other pleasure in life, like riding a bike, or going skiing, or swimming, or playing in the park. That sexuality is just a normal part of our human experience. So on some level, that's true. Sexuality is part of our human experience. However, sexualization of children is not. The idea that we're promoting the sexualization of children at such a young age, a lot of people even want to introduce this in kindergarten. There's a reason that children are not sexual. Their bodies are not mature enough to be sexually active, and they're not emotionally capable of making good decisions about sexuality, and they don't have the maturity to understand the implications of their decisions. So what we're doing is, rather than teaching children to the importance of consent, the importance of creating boundaries and having those boundaries respected, we're teaching them that they have this fun toy called their body, and that their body is there to play with and to give them pleasure, and to interact with others to play with and get pleasure from. And this is a really damaging message. Basically, we're promoting the idea that children are sexual beings. And if we start encouraging children to be sexual, rather than decreasing the rates of unwanted pregnancies and sexually transmitted infections, those are going to increase. So we're putting children on a path towards harmful behaviors. The reason that we treat sexuality different than we do other activities is because it is different. There's a big difference between going and playing at the park and having sex. Children who are sexualized at a young age lose their ability to provide meaningful consent because they lack the boundaries, the personal boundaries, in order to even understand what consent is. We are going to create a whole generation of children who are sexualized, who are unable to protect themselves from sexual predators, who are unable to say no when they don't want to have sex. We are setting them up to be victims. And the irony is they won't even know they're victims because they've been taught that their body is a toy to be played with, both by them and by other people. And they've been taught that if they're not open about sexuality, that they're reinforcing negative stereotypes about sexuality, that they're stigmatizing those who want to be sexual.